This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society. Module 5, Writing, Literacy, and Society. In this lecture, we'll be wrapping up the information that we've talked about in this module and a review of the key concepts. So we talked about the importance that literacy has in a society. So especially a society such as ours, a very great demand is placed on literacy. We talked about the fact that literacy is not a binary skill. There are varying levels of literacy that you can have. And we talked about the level at which a person is able to function in that society, which we, of course, call functional literacy. And so this is an important concept that we use when talking about increasing literacy. The reason literacy is so important is that it's used in so many aspects of our daily life. It's used in education, government, culture, business, social life, among others. You could probably think of many others as well. Now, although literacy is so important to literate societies, a society does not necessarily need to have a writing system to be able to function. So we talked about the example of the Gonja people who are able to maintain an oral history despite not using a writing system. But we did talk about how these histories are still limited in many ways, one of which is that they are limited only to the current situation, only to the here and now. We've discussed some ideas by other scholars who argue that alphabets are inherently advantageous writing systems, and how they kind of don't really hold water. In fact, we see that their arguments weren't really very good ones, but nonetheless that writing does have a lot of advantages, namely that it is a two-dimensional representation of information, and that makes it easy to develop things like tables, which is conducive to thinking about information in an abstract way. And we also talked about how writing makes information very portable. We can transmit very large amounts of information to very different distant places very quickly because writing is done on such a lightweight material, and it allows us to record information in a way that persists for hundreds of years, much longer than an individual's lifespan. So in these ways, writing has some very clear advantages over the medium of speech. We also talked about some reforms, major writing system reforms, which have been implemented, and looked for patterns among them. So we've seen how very often complicated writing systems are seen to be hindrances of literacy. And so very often reform efforts will be made to try to simplify or to nationalize a writing system. We saw how Vietnamese was replaced a Chinese-based writing system with a Latin-based writing system, how Turkish replaced an abjad with an alphabet, and how Korean developed the Hangul system. So these are all systems that were aiming to simplify their writing systems. And we also noticed that in these regions, there is very often a cultural importance associated with the writing system. So it might not just be increasing literacy that can explain these writing systems. There's a significant cultural weight to them. So this explains why the reform of the Hangul system was resisted in its early years, because the previously used Chinese writing system was seen as a connection to the culture and education of China. So many individuals in Korea at the time did not want this kind of reform to take place. And similarly, we saw in Turkey that the shift from the Ottoman culture to a more secular culture corresponded with a shift from an Arabic-based writing system to a Latin-based writing system, kind of in line of Europe. So we can see that there are a lot of parallels between writing systems and culture as well. So improving literacy is not the only goal. However, we've noticed that in many cases, for example, simplifying Chinese and in simplifying European languages, is that these reforms can end up just causing more confusion in the long run. They can just kind of end up making things more complicated unintentionally. And finally, we've noticed that although many improvements have been made to reduce the complexity of a script, we see that this doesn't really correlate with the literacy rates of a country. As evidence of this, we can see that regions which still use the traditional Chinese characters have not been adversely impacted in terms of literacy compared to regions which use the simplified characters, namely mainland China. And really what the important factor when it comes to increasing literacy are the economic factors. So as we mentioned in the previous lesson, the primary factors which are related to literacy are economic. And this makes sense because learning to read is something that requires a lot of economic resources, namely time and educational institutions and resources. And also that there needs to be a demand for literacy in that country. So that part of that means is that there needs to be a lot of, it needs to be likely that an individual will be employed in an occupation where they would be required to be literate. So we can see that literacy and economics are very closely related. And we've seen by looking at the data from UNESCO that the economic factors are the factors which correlate with literacy, whether that's positive or negative. And a script complexity, namely the number of symbols used in the script, has no correlation with literacy. So this is yet more evidence that it's the economic factors that are important for literacy, not the complexity of a script. We've also noticed how literacy is unevenly distributed across the world. We see that there are, the developing world has much lower literacy compared to the developed world, and we see that there are literacy gaps within societies. For example, we see that female literacy is lower compared to male literacy in many regions of the world. Finally, to conclude, so given that literacy is such an important skill for our modern society, and because it conveys so many advantages in terms of how information can be stored and transmitted, it is a very important social issue to be able to increase the access of literacy to individuals around the world. So this is the end of Module 5.